thoughtful, well-spoken Japanese architect, and he's got a very poetic way of speaking, and so we had to cut this hour-long discussion down to sort of 5 short minutes. But one of the things that really came out about it was the fact that he said that he didn't, he was aware of Palladio's work. In fact, he was behind one of the first translations of the Quattro Libre into from Japanese into English into Japanese, and that he found that it took him, almost 30 years to really come to understand Palladio's work, and in fact that it was still a process that he was doing in going and seeing the exhibition. How he felt and thought about Palladio was still an evolving process, and he thought one that would continue, which I think is quite an interesting sort of comment. The other sense of rereading was in the fact that he refers to, and you'll see it in the film, a project that he did, the Fujima Country Club in Japan. And he said he did this, and he suddenly found that it looked incredibly similar to the Villa Poiana, and it was something at the time that he'd completely not seen, read, or thought he'd done. And I think it does raise some really interesting questions about an idea of influence and how Palladio might permeate the thoughts of architects and might come up again. The second one we'll look at is a discussion with Richard McCormack, and again the sort of reading related to a lot of what was discussed today, because he did come out of a tradition, and he very clearly states that his understanding of Palladio came initially from Colin Rowe and Witkover, and then it's there that he's taking his thoughts forward onto how it might relate to his own architecture. And he relates it to a building in Coventry that he did for the cable and wireless building, and which is now the Network Rail building. It's a training building in Coventry, and I must admit that in discussion with him, I sort of had seen where he'd ideologically and intellectually moved through this, but it wasn't until actually going out to the building that it started to make sense and start to sort of resonate with me, that I could understand how he was picking up and thinking about and digesting Palladio. And I think it does relate to some of the comments that have taken place already today. And the words that came out in a lot of these interviews were very much the words, things like translation. And I mean, as we'll hear, Richard very much places himself within a particular time, and he says, architects of my generation are very susceptible to all kinds of historic, influences. And I think it's quite an interesting point that now how we gain influence is a very broad thing, and our relationship to history becomes quite complex. And that he feels that it should be translated into new and hopefully original kinds of syntax. And so hopefully some of these points will come out, and others which you'll see in the films. They are probably a lot more modest than the wonderful one we've just seen here of Ackermann's. We didn't have a lovely helicopter to go over the Veneto countryside, unfortunately. It was a process of myself doing interviews with the architects and co-directing it and producing it with, as Richard said, a young filmmaker called Ruth Chock and Katz. And we had the... and in collaboration with a third person, Nicholas Hornig, who did one of the other films that we won't see today. But it also, we had some music commissioned to accompany these pieces by Dov Waterman, and he was actually responding to knowing very little about architecture. He came in quite late in the process and responded to the interviews and what he saw and the personalities of the various architects. And each piece of music responds and picks up on this. So it is almost another translator, another response to the architect's relationship to Palladio. So I think we'll have a look and see the first now.
First trip to Vicenza, when I was a student, I couldn't understand at all. I couldn't realize why people think Palladio is so important. to understand that, this kind of importance, maybe for me it took 30 years. One day I visited Redentore in Venezia, and I
we've had such treats today, particularly those films at the end. So, oh, we can't hear. Hello? Is that better? Yes. Well, I just wanted to say we've had such treats today, particularly with the films and all that. But we have got two more very important short presentations, and then it's your turn. So anyway, do start, Alan.
I've been asked to talk about what I know of the 1950s. But I know of the influence of what I call Platonizing tendencies in the 1950s in England. Yeah? Is that right? And I will discuss three examples of this influence. And I'll talk very briefly and not enlarge on any of the points I'm going to make. Maybe we can discuss some of them. I think what happened in the 1950s was a search among the post-war architects in England, those who started practicing in the early 1950s. They were searching for what might be called an epistemology of architecture, which went beyond the mechanical and empirical functionalism which was predominant in England at that time, on the one hand, and on the other hand, went beyond the English landscape picturesque tradition, which also was very prominent, which Nicholas Pesner, for instance, supported. This search involved an intense, short-lived but very intense interest in theories of proportion. The first example of this I want to mention is the one which has been mentioned once or twice today, the idea of proportionality in Renaissance architecture, which was the subject of Rudolf Wetkower's book called Architectural Principles in the Age of Humanism. It was published in 1949. This book was read widely by the post-war generation of architects in London. The most thumbed sections of it are part 3, called the Principles of Palladio's Architecture, in which Wetkower discusses the typology of the villas, and part 4, which is called the Problem of the Harmonic Proportion in Architecture, where he defines the proportional system used by Palladio in the villas. The thing, I think, one of the things that excited us about this book and about Palladio was the sense in which it presented an idea of architecture which was independent from simply a collection of buildings, a system involving the notion of typology, in which particularly in relation to the plans, in which a number of different versions of essentially the same idea are presented. I just wanted to say one or two things about the book. Its main concerns are syntactic. Wetkower wasn't in this book particularly concerned with metaphor and allegory. And it wasn't until quite a few years after he wrote this book that the connection between language and architecture rose as a possibility and entered into the discourse in architecture, in which the idea of metaphor became very important. The other thing which he didn't touch on was Palladio's architecture as belonging to the res publica, which Taufuri talks about a lot in his recent book, or his last book on the architecture of the Veneto. Wittkover emphasized, what he does emphasize, which is essentially the subject of his book, I think, is the vital role that a revived Pythagorean Platonic mathematics played in the cosmology of the Renaissance, and how music and architecture was shown as having a special role within this cosmology because of their relation to number and proportion. Wittkover quotes Alberti, which states very succinctly the idea of proportion in architecture at that time. He says, the numbers by means of which the agreement of sounds affects our ears are at the same time are the same as those that please our eyes and mind. So there's an analogy between not only the hearing and seeing, but also between hearing and seeing and the mind, which is absolutely crucial in relation in the Renaissance. Another thing which is absent from Wittkover's study is any mention of the evolution of the idea of this notion of music and architecture, and the idea of proportion. The evolution of those ideas that took place in the 17th century, 50 to 100 years after his death, and the total rejection by Claude Perrault and the other moderns at that time of the idea of connection between musical proportional systems and architectural proportional systems, and the idea that the proportions of ancient architecture were not the perfect examples of correspondence with the universe that was made out, but were simply the products of custom. And so an entire new philosophy began to develop at that time. Of course, Wittkover was not interested in making a historical evolution of the study, although he did mention the evolution of the idea of proportion in another piece of writing published posthumously. But I think that we today have to take these things into consideration and realize that we are dealing with a historical situation, and to struggle with the question as to what how exactly the past does pass into the future, and how the influence of one era can be affected 200 or 300 years later within a social and economic situation which is totally different from what it was at the time. The second example of the influence of proportion I want to give is the idea of Platonic form in nature. And this is the subject of two books that were much read at the time in the early 50s. Darcy Thompson's Growth and Form, originally written in 1917 and reprinted in 1950, or around about 1950. And Lancelot Law White's book, Aspects of Form, published in 1951. The centre of this interest really was the ICA in London, which in those days was located in Dover Street. there was a lot of interest in these ideas among young architects and architectural historians and intellectuals in the art world who got together quite frequently at the ICA for lectures in the evening. And two events were very important at that time, which propagated these ideas of proportion in nature, was two exhibitions which were put on by the ICA, one in 1951 and 1953. The first one was called, the exhibition was called On Growth and Form, which was the same title as Darcy Thompson's book. And the second one was called The Parallel of Life and Art. At the same time that these influences were felt in England, there was an interest in America also in the idea of a sort of Platonic idea of continuity, especially connected with Platonic notions. And I can mention three people three architects who were particularly interested in different aspects of this: Buckminster Fuller, Conrad Waxman, and Louis Kahn. The third example I want to give is Le Corbusier's Modulo, which was published in English in 1954, and which, as it were, took up from these interests in proportion, which already existed through the work of Wittkower. And I should mention, of course, Colin Rowe, who has also been mentioned in this connection, who was a pupil of Wittkower's. Le Corbusier's Modulo is a very peculiar book. The aim, as he states in the introduction, was to provide the spatial equivalent of the musical score in space, to break up the continuum of space into sections that can be measured, just as the musical score breaks up a continuum of sound into sections that can be measured. Le Corbusier assumes here, which I'm not sure he is justified in doing, that the organization of the sensory apparatus is the same for the eye and the ear. And he also assumes that the instrument that measures space has the equivalent mediating function in relation to the production of architecture as the score has in relation to the production of music. I think it's not time this evening to try and go into this question more deeply, but these two aspects of the modulo have always worried me a bit. The only person I know who actually used the modulo was Bill Howell from the firm of Howell and Killick, and he used it in the design of the somewhat neo-Corbusian Roehampton estate flats. Though I don't know how completely, in what sense he used the modulo, and whether he made the same use of it as Corbusier had intended. But as far as I know, he's the only one who actually tried to apply the modulo, only one in England who tried to apply the modulo. If anybody knows of anybody else, I'd be most interested to know. At the time that Howell and Killick were building the Roehampton estate, Sandy Wilson, Peter Carter, and I were working equally at the LCC on another neo-Corbusian building in the East End, and we did not apply the modulo to it, because I think we were all somewhat skeptical about Corbusier's notion of the modulo. Anyhow, that's really all I have to say, and maybe the other people can enlarge on the points I've made. And
Thank you. I'm sure they might
unlike Alan, I didn't start before I came here with a very clear brief, and as a result of discussions, also as a result of these many varied, rich, fascinating contributions this afternoon, what I decided I should say just a very few words about is what has been a sort of basic, not always explicit question this afternoon, simply what can we learn as architects or as historians or as people who are deeply interested in architecture from Palladio. And this at once raises the question of what Palladio. And this is a question which is fundamental, obviously, to any discussion of his influence from his own time onwards, on the basis of what buildings, of what reading of the buildings, of what books, of what modern studies, on the basis of what interpretations, what theories. And the question is a very central one, because just as an architect may in the 17th century, 18th century have only seen one or two buildings, often people who study Palladio may not have seen all the buildings, or may not have managed to get into this or that villa. The idea of the original appearance of the buildings is also quite important. We saw in Jim Ackerman's film how he discusses the facade of San Giorgio. We now know absolutely with certainty that the facade of San Giorgio was not designed by Palladio. Palladio wanted to have columns in the portico. We also now know that the interior of San Giorgio in Venice, which was built by Palladio, completed during his lifetime, was a very vital composition in white and red. There were large areas which had exposed brickwork, or rather brickwork which was painted over, plastered over in red to protect the bricks underneath, so that the whole reading of that church on the basis of historical information completely changes. Then we also need, above all as historians obviously, to remember that historians are very often wrong. They don't have a document, or they decide to ask questions which are perhaps not seen by later historians the central one. So that the concentration of Wittkower on proportions, read as he reads the proportions, and his way of establishing typologies with little line drawings is perhaps not the most helpful way to get to what Palladio is about. And if one's going to ask what we can learn from Palladio, we need to try and say what Palladio was about, what sort of architect he is, what his personality is, not as a person, because we hardly know that, but as an architect, what his goals were, and what the whole intellectual framework there is behind his approach. And here, I think now, at the state of present research, we can be fairly sure about that. He is a classical architect, who's classical in that his approach to architecture was defined by his reading of Vitruvius, by his discussion and work on Vitruvius with Daniele Barbaro, that is, looking at Vitruvius within a philosophical framework taken from antiquity, and with a further focusing of his classical approach, calling it a classical approach, on the basis of Leon Battista Alberti. So what does this actually mean? It means that he has a typological approach to design. He has a top-down approach. You begin with considering the overall requirements, making a design which relates to a typology, and you go from the whole down to the parts, and then down to the architectural details, which need to be in keeping with the sort of type of building it is and the sort of building it is, so that even the part is saying something about the importance of the building, the function of the building, the person who commissioned it, and so on. And if, in the course of designing, an architect of this sort, a Palladio sort, decides, well, I'm not going to do it like that, I'm going to modify the overall design, then all the parts will have to be revised. It's not a way, it's not like a medieval way of building the building because you have some nice capitals that you found in a Roman building and cut it off, and then you put in your own building. It's starting with an overall concept. Fundamental always to his approach is the Vitruvian triad. You know, the buildings have got to be buildings that will last. They've got to be solidly constructed. They've got to be functional, and they've got to be beautiful. And these three requirements all work together. You can't separate one from the other. So that with the column bases of the small columns on the lower level of the basilica are just simple cylinders, but they're simple cylinders for a functional reason, so as not to trip you up, and for an aesthetic reason, so as not to create too much noise with a fussy little detail on the small column. You have the nice attic basis for the big columns, just a simple cylinder for the small columns. And there, another element enters, and it hasn't been sufficiently, I would say, emphasized in Palladio's working theory, the theories and the ideas that actually determine specifics of the design. And this is something that's really edging its way in Palladio's ideas and his designing in with the Vitruvian triad, and that is simply economy. Economy is beautiful for Palladio. Economy is a good thing. Economy is reasonable. Economy means not throwing away money, and it means being able to finish the building. And this is a theme that is always present in the four books. So if you just have to cut the simple cylindrical base for those small columns, not only you are not tripping people up when they try to go to the shopping mall, which is the lower level, the basilica, but you are saving money, which means that the whole building can be finished sooner. Together with all this, there's another side, and it's a side to Palladio which I think we're just really beginning to understand and get some grasp of now. There is the fact that from the time that he was held in baptism by Vicenza Grande, that is by a sculptor and architect, he was always close to artists. And he admired artists, he admired their way of doing things, and probably also admired and probably was influenced by the sort of talk and the sort of theories that are created in the 16th century around the figure of the artist, and above all around the great figure of Michelangelo, that the artist has this near divine judgment which enables him to realize and invent in a beautiful, striking, marvelous way which goes beyond the rules. And Palladio, who writes with such enthusiasm and of generosity in his book about the decoration of his villas, admired these painters and admired these sculptors and wanted, I would suggest, to be in part like them, as well as being rational, as well as adhering to nature. Then there are other sides to Palladio. Palladio becomes a part of, as a sort of intellectual and architectural satellite, of a part of a particular slice of the Venetian ruling establishment. The intellectuals, the reformers, the people who want to create a better world. And they see him and quite explicitly give him a mission, which is that of remaking the world in terms of houses, in terms of palaces, in terms of villas, in terms of the city, in a better way, so that it should be healthier, it should be more rational, it should be more comfortable, it should be more decorous, it should be more impressive, and remaking the productive elements of the countryside, the villa complexes, so that the countryside should provide all the food that is necessary for Venice and for the cities of the terra firma, so that the Venetian state doesn't any longer have to import grain from the Ottoman Empire, which is always a potential danger, the potential enemy. So he's part of a project which is a total political project, a strategic project, but also is a moral project. And this moral side of Palladio, that he has a real mission. He has a mission as a public figure, in the sense that he's someone who is acting in the public field and is actually changing things publicly, which goes with a private mission, a private vocation, and desire to do his work as well as he can as an architect, putting everything that he knows, as he says on the second page of his book, that I can only promise you great labour and great love, he says. So that is the sort of Palladio that has come out, is coming out of more recent discussions and researches and the exhibition itself. So what can we learn from this Palladio? Well, I think we obviously, and this point was very well expressed by Richard McCormack, we probably don't want to copy a facade, copy a capital, use Palladian orders, and so on. But there is something deeper, and McCormack referred to this very, very effectively, I think, in what he said in the film. That is, Palladio sets a standard. Palladio is a classic in the sense of a figure who's always there, who is demanding, who demands, asks a lot from us just to understand how he's doing things, what he's trying to do, what his criteria are, what the relation is between Vitruvian triad, which doesn't go away. It's always there. There's always a function. There's always the need to make a building that looks good. There's always the need to have a good structure. He is demanding. He makes one think how he designed the buildings. His drawings themselves demand a lot from one. And so he is someone who keeps an architect, or people who are interested in architecture, up to the mark. He sets a standard. He sets a moral standard. He's a reminder that if you don't have a general, wider, personal, but also collective project to act within the present situation in your world, now in the world, it's not likely that you're going to be able to achieve very much in the end. And his role, I think, is the role of the classics, and one can remember of, not a contemporary of his, but of a couple of generations before, Machiavelli, his relation to the past. And that sort of relation of Machiavelli to the past is perhaps the sort of relation one should try to build, to deepen with Palladio. There's the famous letter of Machiavelli when he describes when he was exiled in a miserable little village outside Florence, and he spent part of the day in the local pub, and then he came back home and took off the rather muddy clothes which he wore outside in the country, put on his best suit, as it were, dressed as if he was an ancient Roman, and then he starts talking with the ancients and really dialoguing with them. And though we are not going to put on 16th century clothes, Palladio offers the possibility of a dialogue, and in many ways offers analogies which shouldn't be forced. That Palladio is a postmodern. The modern that he is post is late Gothic architecture, early Renaissance architecture, which he says that's no good. You've got to do something else. He is a modern in the sense that he wants to rebuild the world. He doesn't like anything that's happened before, and he wants to do something new. And even his emphasis on nature, which he takes from Alberti, has something that is not so different from a concern with the environment. The fact that you need to work with nature, you need to do things that are in harmony with nature, obviously in a world that's environmentally threatened, that is relevant too. And even the way in which his intellectual interests are very wide, in which he moves into fields which aren't the core fields even in his time of architecture, into agricultural improvement, into military studies connected with the security of the Venetian state, perhaps raises the question as to whether the architect today should not start a bit more moving into a wider public field, not in the way that happened in the times of the expansion on the territory of modernism, but in a more modest but also more intellectually incisive way in relation to environmental issues, and in relation also to the quality of life, which is something that Palladio was very much concerned with, so that his idea of architecture as a consolation is very close to ideas which also being validated by research that, you know, beautiful buildings make you feel good and improve your health. So these are just some notions around a relationship, a dialogue with Palladio.
Now I wonder if the other three speakers could come up and sit around the table. I wonder now if anyone would like to put a question to any one of the speakers. It's harder for the ones that performed earlier for you to remember all the different points, but have a go anyway. You don't have to put a question, but do feel it if you can. Right, do go ahead.
I'd like to ask, it's a very formal and specifically architectural question. I'm fascinated by the superimpositions on the facades of the Redentore in San Giorgio. And to me, having read Colin Rowe on transparency, I'm intrigued by the possibility that a facade can offer both literal and representational schema. I'm also sort of experimenting myself, mentally as it were, with comparing this idea of superimposition or layering, if you want to call it, with Alberti's ideas about lineaments. And I wonder if anyone could speak to these issues about the superimposition of forms and representations in Palladio.
Who would like to answer that?
I'd like to make a point, because there's always been some confusion, I think, in architecture historians as to whether what you call superimposition of facades in, say, the Redentore, is that a mannerist procedure, or is it something else? In a way, it's a logical procedure if you're saying that you, for reasons of expense or any other reason, you can't make a real three-dimensional facade with a portico which projects out, as we now know, or now suppose was the case, in fact, that Palladio wanted to happen in San Giorgio. If you're forced to flatten the facade and make, as it were, a two-dimensional planar picture of the architecture that you want to construct, there may be occasions when you wish to suggest that there are two facades there working independently, one over the other. And it seems to me that that's not really necessarily something which is particularly mannerist in the sense of Giulio Romano, for instance. It's something which derives from, originally from economic considerations. But I'd like to know whether there's anything in that. But what do you feel about that?
I'm simply excited in a very specifically aesthetic way by the co-presence of multiple phenomena, let's say, in an aesthetic figure.
Mm.
It's a kind of Gestalt game, which I enjoy, and I think Venturi is alive to it in a different way. And I think it's in a great deal of Renaissance architecture from Alberti onwards. And I think it's something that is also available to specific physics of the classical language.
I maybe should just add a word that I talked about this sort of area yesterday at the Academy. And my view is that Palladio very often using an orthogonal elevation of an ancient building, having recorded the scheme in that form, reads the elevation in different and creative ways. And this is central to his way of designing. But that, and here I think one needs to be a bit skeptical about what Wittkower says about the superimposing of two temple front schemes, that he doesn't really think in that sort of way. And the side elements in a typical Palladio facade, where you get a half pediment, are in fact just a response to the need to design the facade, or they're conceived of as being distinct half pediment elements, like the window edicules with half pediments, which are quite distinct elements, which one finds in the hemicycle of Trajan's market in Rome. So that he's not having a wide, low temple front and then putting a higher one in the middle. He's designing a single thing.
Could I comment on that? It seems to me that the problem that Palladio conceived he had was a problem which the previous architects of the 100 years before had also had. There's evidence, I think, that what they want to do is to convert a Gothic facade into a Roman facade.
Yes.
And there are previous examples, I can't remember offhand what they are, in which the two quarter...
There's the Romanti one and the Peruzzi one, which are the principal ones.
Yes, but the Romanti one is a complete facade over all three aisles, right? But there are other churches where the two side aisles have a quarter lean-to roof.
Yes.
And there's a pediment in the middle section. And some of the architects at that time, earlier than Palladio, were putting a string course across from one side to the other, which is completely contrary to the Gothic idea, which was that you have three vertical columns of space, as it were. The Renaissance were trying to unify those by a string course running right the way across. Now, doesn't that imply already the idea that there are two facades superimposed one on the other?
Would you like to speak?
I'd like to add by questioning your question. And aren't we too much in an idealist tradition when we look, as Wittkower did, for what could be behind what we see really? You know? So it's Vorstellung. It's Vorstellung which in this generation was so essential. Wittkower, in his idealizing the classical authority of Palladio, would have liked to see what he really wanted, what was not there. What is there? A built facade with a syntax, and the syntax, as Howard showed, the film of James Ackerman's said also, tried to find different ways of combining different elements into a whole. But the facade is there as it is. I believe, naturally, as you say, Gestalt was so important as a theoretical background in that modern phase of thing. But still, it's there. If I should, as a historian, try to say the little thing I can say, I would say it's still different. Palladio says by himself that he used to put before his palaces and villas, but he did naturally for the churches, a frontespizio in ante. So he has a very simple, straightforward formula to denote a very complex issue. But he says it, I put the facade, I put the temple facade before a building. Why should I go beyond in making my analysis? It is already such an astonishing freshness of saying, I take a temple facade and I use it and put it. Much I do not explain why there should be a superimposition. I wouldn't say, yes, he has his means of grammar, of syntax, but not more. But we have common friends, they made even designs of saying, actually he would have liked to have a portico, but he did not. He built the facade. He built the facade, and we have to accept what factually is being built. And the rest, we call it image, we call it a result which is made, but we should go back and see what is really there, and not see what visually we would like to see. And I would say that in Wittcoverian time, many people would have liked to see something else which was then really there. Don't know if I explain myself, but the factual reality of architecture is what is there and nothing else.
I just want to add something that to simplify this issue of the famous kind of overlapping facade. I mean, the thing was that I see actually as one of Palladio's main concern this kind of correspondence between the inside and the outside. And let's not forget that the first attempt to make this facade is San Francesco alla Vigna, where he has to design a facade for an existing building, which is basically by Sansovino. And basically his invention of this, which is, let's say, an evolution of two precedents by Bramante and by Peruzzi, which Burns has mentioned, was precisely to solve this problem, how the interior of the church could have a reasonable, rational projection on the outside. And Palladio is really the first architect who really mastered in a very strong way this relationship, much more than other architects before him, who were sometimes, and actually even in San Francesco alla Vigna there is a kind of maybe the historians will forgive me for this, a kind of clumsy solution, which is that Palladio puts the minor order and the bigger order on the same pedestal. So the relationship between the minor order and the pedestal is completely out of proportion. So he's really struggling to make a rational projection in public space of basically of the interior. And to me that struggle, that effort, it really tells a lot about Palladio's mentality, which is to go beyond the sort of tricks that, for example, very often Bramantes use in his architecture to make very rational architecture. Of course, he doesn't succeed fully in it. For example, in the Chiaricati facade, it's very clear that there is a little detail where he cannot really stick in these projections. But I think these projections between inside and outside is, for me, a very strong aspect of his design, and you can see that already in his way of drawing. His way of drawing orthogonal projections are really the way through which he sees architecture.
May I add one sentence? Eventually it helps. I try to say that in that tradition, and look to the films, the Hisotsaki and so on, the universal idea of architecture was identified very much with space. But space is not the physical reality. You build a relief, or you put stone on stone. So it's a different way to look at architecture, which influences all our interpretation of architecture. Space is space, and epistemology, I don't know if you have an epistemology of space. You have an epistemology of columns, of different pieces of stone, of different profiles. This builds our epistemology, whereas space is a universal quality, and naturally this modern tradition was looking for universals.
Well, if I may add a historical note to that. Barbaro, in his edition of Vitruvius, spent a lot of time defining what kind of discipline architecture is. And in the end, he put it not among the philosophical ones, unfortunately, so no epistemology, not the metaphysics, but he put it somewhere across the practical and the operative arts, which means that our whole tendency, of which Wittgauer is such a prime example, to read all sorts of philosophical modes of thought into how people at the time designed or thought about a design, is, I think, a complete anachronism. And if you want to look for a theory of composition at the time, the only one that was available was rhetoric. Rhetoric taught you how to compose sentences and speeches. And it is in the rhetorical treatises in Cicero that we find for the first time the analogy between the entrance of a temple and a sentence or a book and the frontispiece. So, I mean, here again, I don't want to bash Wittgauer, but it's interesting to look at it in this way, but it has nothing to do with the history of architecture or the way people thought about the discipline at the time.
Paul, can you get in there?
Yes, I'd like to ask a question to Professor Byrne. We saw the Ackerman film, one building by Palladio, which nobody has mentioned, but which Colquhoun made central to his own view of architecture, was the Casa Gugolo, Palladio's town house in Vicenza, which had a famous blank panel. The blank panel was what Colquhoun seized on, and he made that the center of his whole theory of architecture, which I think greatly influenced James Stirling. We were sent to Florence to look at the Casa Gugolo. We were sent to look at the casino by Zuckerman, what's his name? Zuckerman, and so on. And I even noticed this time when I was there, as you exit from the Lawrenciana Library, and you stand on the staircase about to come down, and there are 3 bays all round, and the central bay opposite you is blank. So blankness was something that Colquhoun imposed on Palladio. Do you think Palladio has any ambiguity in it? Or do you think he was a straight down guy?
Well, in that particular case, he didn't have any choice because the owner of the house, who was a notary, not a noble, no, a well-to-do professional man, applied to have Vicentine citizenship, which brought considerable fiscal advantages. And the city, following on a long medieval tradition of granting citizenship to the people who are ready to come and build a house in the town, you'd already had the house, said, well, you spend up to the at least this sum on the facade of your house, and you can have the citizenship. And the house was a modest house with, on the 2 upper living floors, a single room with windows, as you look towards the street, windows at the sides, and in the middle of the wall towards the street, there was a fireplace. So you can't have a window there.
This is Venetian, all houses in that.
That's right. Which is a completely stupid idea, which very often Palladians in England shift things around because you lose so much heat towards the exterior. But nothing could be done about it. It's a closed wall there in the middle. And so he created this blank area, which in fact was decorated with a fresco, which has disappeared in the meantime, but we know from from 19th century watercolors that it was there. So that's the very straightforward reason for the central blank closure. It isn't a aesthetic, audacious, revolutionary move. It just had to be like that.
The Zuckerman Casino also had a blank panel, which was intended to be filled with a painting to show that Zuckerman was master of painting as well as a sculptor and architect.
That's right. So and with a room behind, which was similar.
The whole of the blank panel mythology that Rowe constructed is out of thin air.
In Via Giusti in Florence.
I'm not sure about the Corvisio example that triggered Colin's interest in it. In the Villa Schwab.
In that case, Palladio created frames for pictures that were specifically intended for that. I'm intrigued by the remark I heard before that he didn't like Veronese's interior frescoes of Villa Marza. And when I heard that, I was thinking of a lecture which the American sculptor Richard Serra gave about 15 years ago at Yale, in which he cited Corbusier on the nefarious effects of fresco on architecture, because he said the fresco destroys the wall, and Michelangelo's ceiling destroys the ceiling. Serra took this up.
Just about at the level of Richard Serra.
Well, Serra is a vociferous protagonist of the autonomy of sculpture as against architecture. But the point is here, I'm intrigued by the point that Bob's brought up, that you have a frame. Now the frame separates any image or figure from what is around it, whereas what began to intrigue me was precisely the fact that they bleed into each other and interfere with each other and produce these multiple gestalts.
No, it's not. I'm not reacting to Gestalt as I like very much. I like very much this important tradition of Gestalt. No, I'm trying to say something different. There's a famous philosopher of these British islands, Hume. Hume already said so clearly, human mankind likes to confound what they see and what is what they see. That Hume says people like to confound what they see and what they like to see. See? So Husserl would say this has been the strongest error in recent epistemology. And we know psychologically that we like naturally. We cannot every moment say this isn't, we see it and make a distinction. We see, we perceive, and we have sensations combined by perceiving, you know. What does it mean for all that story? I tried to say it in two sentences. The one is, what is clear, historically clear, that all those notions such as classic, mannerist, baroque are a posteriori constructions. This is clear. We impose a plausible explanation in order to understand phrase or whatever, or the Casa Google and so on. No. The second is, if we are particularly important, Whitcover, Colin Rowe, we will have such, this is now polemic, we will have such ideas, and later we become part of the history. You know what I mean? Whitcover will remain as he was so important in influencing, making explicit ways of looking to architecture in his time. Colin Rowe was so important in helping to look at architecture by, say, mannerism. But this was part of that history. And we never would accept in our days that it makes sense to speak about manners, but it was important, and it's important for us to understand what history meant in the 50s and the 60s. So this has a little polemical side, but we must accept that there is always a shift in history. We always change, and things go beyond ourselves, and we leave what has been left, and we should not lose what has been made or created as an error. Might I make still another observation? When Howard explained what he believes today, or came to economics, came to moral, I could have two explanations. One is naturally Aristotle at the time, he puts, when you look to those who commented Aristotle at the time, they had this parallel vision of looking to political and economic, and they both makes part of moral and ethics. Only we forget that for those times it was quite normal to have Aristotle, and it's less normal for us as art historians. But I give you an example about the shift of time. James Ackman liked very much a little German book when it came out in the 60s. This book had this title, Herrschaftsarchitektur. Does this say something to you? We would say some leftist came and said, terrible, Palladio was making nice buildings for capitalists, Oh yes, this was written like that. And James Ackman time said, oh well, that's interesting. Yes. And now Howard puts it a different way, me too. It is essential for us to see that Palladio found people who helped him building representational architecture somehow. So you see how the shifts, in a time where there was only, it seems, only an aesthetic way to look at. Somebody came up with a capitalist leftist idea, and we say, well, we agree totally. One of Palladio's major achievement was Hausbau. He invented house and villa architecture against the Romans who simply wanted to build churches. It's very simplified. But again, just to say how we shift, how we have these shifts in time, and how we change our attitudes, and what has been wrong is not dismissed. It starts to have a different meaning. It has a meaning in order to in informing us about former times and their interests.
Are you talking about ideology?
Sorry, by chance.
Are you talking about ideology? Are you talking about ideology?
Well, if I must, I can also introduce this word, but I don't need it. I could, ideology is still another thing. No, I take it really seriously. I wouldn't dismiss Colin Rowe for saying that he was wrong, No. I would never. He had good arguments to find and denote the criteria he was choosing and looking for, So it is consistent, It is consistent, coherent what Wittkower says, but still, it is not totally in conformity with factual truths.
No.
But who is in conformity? Palladio was not in conformity with factual truths as to a total knowledge of antiquity. He had his interpretation.
Absolutely.
And we admire him for that.
Anything to speak, Oh, can someone pass those?
Oh, thank you very much. We were talking about Palladio and classicism and about the ancient Roman. And then we mentioned Le Corbusier. And the expression, the classic. Palladio is classic. No, but we mentioned something common between Le Corbusier and Palladio. This cannot be the classic. This is not classic. My question is, what is common between Le Corbusier and Palladio? Because something common, I think there is between the two, and there is no expression today. We don't have the expression what it is. And I am asking, maybe we cannot answer today or tomorrow, what is common between Le Corbusier and between Palladio? I think that we partly go ahead mentally in all this, thinking about all this question. And partly we go ahead and partly we do the opposite. And what comes out, this is my question today.
Who's going to answer? Would you answer?
What is the connection between Le Corbusier and Palladio?
Yes.
In what way are they similar? Well, they both depended very largely on books. I would say that's very important. And it's also very important that they had a notion of the res publica, which you talked about, which, of course, in Palladio's case, it was part of the ideology of the time, the problem of the time, which he fitted into. In Le Corbusier's case, he invented one, you know, it's an actual invention, but it's still the idea of an architecture, a public architecture. And I think that those two things are in common between Corbusier and Palladio.
No, I think that's, in terms of kind of Colin Rowe comparison, I agree. I mean, what Werner just said, that's an interpretation that was made in a very particular time, where also it worked as a provocation. Colin Rowe wanted to shock modern architects at that time and to show them that it was possible to put Le Corbusier and Palladio on the same level and to establish a kind of comparative analysis. And of course, it's a very well done exercise, but of course there was a kind of almost Dadaist impetus to really be iconoclastic and to go beyond actually with cover, to say, I'm sorry, you know, we can even extend this to modern architecture. I think that there would be another comparison which I find maybe today more interesting than this one by Colin Rowe, which is, yes, one thing which I think is very important, that as Schinkel, as other architects, Palladio and Le Corbusier gave incredible importance to books, to this kind of medium where a project is not only about building, but it's about representation. And I think that's the issue of corporality versus the idea. I think we are between the 16th century and the 20th century, we are really going through this crisis in which the corporality start to fight with basically the idea, and where there are a lot of architects who have influence basically through mediums such as books, Durand, Schinkel, so on and so forth. Another, for me, very interesting ground of comparison is precisely what Howard Barnes was saying before. Palladio has a project which is not just to have a nice building, but a very intellectual framework where the patron, in that framework, the patron is not simply the patron. The patron embodies an idea, a sort of project, a meta project, and in fact, at the beginning of his career, Le Corbusier was in Paris, was struggling. I mean, l'Esprit Nouveau was a kind of way to get these patrons, of course, to get his Barbaro, to get his Trissino, which of course was not the same kind of intellectual, was basically the capitalist, the industrialist. When he said, when he actually launched l'Esprit Nouveau, his actually main target was to attract these possible patrons. And I think that's, I agree with Helen, in this kind of, on this level, we see that both were trying to go beyond design, were of course very much skillful in design, they were very good builders, but they thought that architecture needs such an intellectual and factual organization that they have to basically instrumentalize a broader kind of conception of the city. But I think for me a difference between Palladio and Le Corbusier, which is what makes for me Palladio to a certain extent more contemporary than Le Corbusier, is that Palladio he never made a totalizing project of the city. His work was very much perhaps modest. He never arrived to this kind of totalizing image, an ideal city. It was more site-specific, yet the incredible force of his language, which has a certain unifying kind of approach, made that kind of site specificity very, in a way, constructing a intelligible image of the city. And I think Le Corbusier has the problem that in order to construct this kind of architecture of the city, he has to make the big plan. He has to make basically, he has to frame his projects within a literal plan. And that's why I think that for me, I feel, I mean, as an architect, I feel that our times are somehow more closer to Palladio's approach than Le Corbusier's approach.
Just I would like to say that we should conclude our discussion because it's already 6:45 and it's impressive that there are still people in this room after 6 hours. Please but please, if you have final thoughts, comments, then we can conclude.
I would agree totally with the last what you said and say a thing which is always underestimated. We have evidence that Palladio is modern in that particular sense, that he was looking for the new. He speaks about nuova usanza, that's his term. He makes something new. And when Gattameter Quinze, who is the most intelligent amongst ourselves, tries to say what is Palladio, he makes so many descriptions and finishes c'est du Palladio. But what is behind c'est du Palladio? It's not only the obvious, but he says in Paris, when somebody builds a new house and it looks quite okay and is elegant, people say c'est du Palladio. So Palladio is also the beer of newness in any of those interpretations. The short thing was the question about Giscard. There are two things, Palladio and Le Corbusier, which are concrete or factual. The one is the proportion situation. When in 1951 in Milan was the Congress on Proporzioni, Wittkower appeared and proposed his architecture print, and Le Corbusier came and proposed this modular. So there's a coincidence of interest. We know that they didn't really speak together, but it's a factual coincidence that which says that the proportion was the big issue at the time, and it was believed that both were those spears of this idea. Second is, Le Corbusier speaks little about Palladio, but he puts an image of the Villa Rotonda in one of his little writings. The writing where he reproduces it is on perennité. So in this particular moment when he speaks about architecture being endless, beyond time, he uses an image. He doesn't even name Palladio. He has the image, and the last sentence before this image is, architecture is au-delà du calcul. So it's this ongoing modern conflict. Is it something which can be calculated, or do we still need something which goes beyond the artist? So there's an identification of Le Corbusier with Palladio, which you would say cannot be exploited by ourselves when you reduce it to all the rational things, but probably there's something beyond.
Right, well, I just want to thank all the speakers around this table. And also to say 20th century, 21st century Palladio that Howard has created in this room. Sort of. So, thank you.